Welcome everyone to Core Conversations. I am Charlie Thomas, Executive Director of ACTC, and Core Conversations is our online lecture and conversation series. So however you found us, we're glad you found us. It is February 2022 right now, for those of you who are seeing this. And so if you're seeing this before February 14th, which is just a few days away, there's still time to submit proposals for this April's ACTC conference at the University of Notre Dame. So if you need help with that, let me know. We have had a few glitches. It wouldn't be ACTC if we didn't have a few technical glitches, but we're getting everyone in there and sorting things out. And we'd love to have you join us in April for our first face-to-face conference in a couple of years. So join us. But today it is very much my pleasure to introduce Krishnan Venkatesh to you. Krishnan joined me a couple of weeks ago to record some remarks on the ancient Chinese historian Sima Qian. I'm working on the pronunciation there. Maybe Krishnan will help us with that. Fascinating remarks. If you got a chance to listen to them, watch them already, that's great. If not, they're available on YouTube. And this also will be available on YouTube for you to watch this conversation if you're not able to join with us today. So Krishnan, I'm going to hand it over to you. Krishnan is a longtime tutor at St. John's College, Santa Fe, and author of two books, one on the Buddha and another one on Lord of the Rings. They should happen to hold up. They're both sitting over here on my on my desk. So thanks again, Krishnan, for the great remarks. And today we're here just to talk. So how would you like to get us started?
Okay, I'll just start just saying some general things. By the way, it's pretty clear why the author of Book of Lord of the Rings might actually be interested in something like this. The book is a vast world, cast of hundreds, and a web of characters and events and intricate causal connections, lots of pivotal dialogues. It's a fascinating book, full of twists and turns. And in itself, I think the book is a masterpiece. The more you read it, the more connections you see, the more sides of a character you find. He doesn't give us everything at once. And it's a book that repays multiple readings. In some ways, I think the book is it's a very nourishing political education in training the kind of attention that you need to put two and two together, to make connections, to read between the lines. But other than that, as literature, it's a masterpiece. So if you haven't read it, you should read it just for that alone. It's a book that's well worth it. But one of the things that is especially important to me at this time is that in studying these ancient Chinese works of political or historical literature, is that it gives us a chance to rethink, because these books don't share the same presuppositions as our traditions. And so in a time when, say, in the 21st century, when we find our own political institutions in crisis, and it isn't any more self-evident that we're capable of governing even, or of taking care of our people. So when things are like on the edge of crumbling from day to day, then I think it's incentive to reevaluate and to look back to the past, to reread the great books that are our foundation, but also to try to step outside that box. And it's a big box, it's a big and complex box, to try to step outside it and to think through alternatives, as I think other governments have been doing, like the Chinese government has actually been studying these books too, to find some kind of philosophical legitimacy for their own policies and their own approaches. So that's what's going on in the background. So I think that now it's I think it's a significant opportunity for us to actually rethink certain things. And, of course, this has worked for decades. And I'll give you like one example of the kind of thing that you find when you read, say, someone like Sima Qian or the Chinese histories, is that nobody in those books ever talks about freedom, for example. Right? Whereas when you read the Greek histories and the Roman histories, it's all about freedom. Freedom is is one of the key concepts. So when you find this kind of like startling omission or startling difference, then I think it's a good opportunity to sit back and discuss, and try to think like, why, what's going on, especially when you with a book like Sima Qian, when you realize this is a very sophisticated, very deep thinker, at least as good as Herodotus or Thucydides. So this is no fool, and is somebody who's sincerely trying to think through problems of how it is that we can be together, how it is that what a good human life is. And so they're trying to work these things out too, thinking these out as intelligent human beings with what they know, what they have, with the experience that they have, and they come up with a different set of things. And so I think it's a good challenge for us. We might go into that and we might think we might come out thinking that we were right, but at least we would have grappled with a significant difference with respect, and to try to get behind what they're thinking. So I think it's important for us to read these books at this time. At St. John's, we in the Eastern Classics program, we actually spend 8 weeks reading this book, and even then we read less than half of it, and of course the real reading is in the rereading, and that we could easily spend a year studying this. But anyway, with that, I'll just throw it open for questions.
Great.
Discussion.
And I think we're a small enough group. Let's just try to do this free form if we can. If you're not speaking, go ahead and mute yourself so we don't get feedback. And if this doesn't work, I will be happy to recognize people and we can hold up our hands and things like that. But let's just try to see if we can have a more open conversation. So the floor is open, as they say.
Krishnan and Charlie, this is Charles Clonch.
Hi, Charles.
Hello, Krishnan. I was a student of Krishnan's back in the day. You mentioned that there are different presuppositions behind this work, and I understand the value of reading a work on its own hook, as it were. But would you recommend that a reader coming fresh to Eastern civilizations read something else, other works from approximately the same time period, or like Confucius, or modern works of scholarship, of philosophy, of history, to provide a background for Sima Qian?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think if something helps, it helps. And certainly with Sima Qian, I think it does help if you have read Confucius and Xunzi and Han Feizi and Lao Tzu. It helps, but because they're mentioned in the text, and sometimes these figures are the teachers of some of the characters, some of the main movers in the text. So it does help, but I think you can also start from Sima Qian and get a lot out of it, because he's not his whole work is not predicated on knowing these other thinkers. His stories take on a life of their own. The historical narrative takes on a life of its own. So I don't think you have to start there. So I'd say start anywhere. You got to start somewhere. Just jump in. And this book has got a lot of good stories. So I'd say it's an easier starting place than Confucius. Right. So Confucius is a very cryptic, brief, enigmatic, and you need to chew on Confucius quite a bit before individual sentences open up. I have a Confucius class right now with the graduates with the Eastern Classics program, and in each class we might discuss 10 sentences. So that's how dense it is. This book you can actually read. I think you can read and enjoy. So in terms of places to start, I can't think of a better place to start to get into China, ancient China, and how these people think, and the variety of ways of thinking there are. Did that answer your question, Charles?
It did. 95%.
Okay.
Are there? I remember reading the book with pleasure, but I had a hard time fitting it in with maybe a larger context. And I was wondering if there are any modern histories of China, or reasonably modern histories of China, that you would suggest glancing at, perhaps, to understand the relationship of the Qin dynasty to its historical context, or the Han dynasty.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot, and I can send out a separate email once I've kind of like trawled through them. But I mean, I think that the Qin dynasty volume, actually, it's very it's pretty self-contained, and I think the Han dynasty, I think they're pretty self-contained, and I think that since the any modern history starts from reading those, right? So you should start where they start. Read the histories. They're getting a lot of their stuff from Sima Qian. I always think that when you explain thing A with thing B, the presupposition is that thing B is less problematic than thing A, right? And especially that if you read an authority on ancient China, you think, oh, I got it. I got some context. Now I know something. But if you read another authority in ancient China, then you realize that the authorities don't agree with each other, and you kind of left puzzled. I mean, this is the same with like any scholarship, right? So often reading one work of scholarship might seem to make things less problematic, but you read multiple works of scholarship, you realize that the problems, you just push the problems to a different level. So I'd say start where they start with Sima Qian, for the same reason. With Western great books, we start with Herodotus, we start with Thucydides. We don't start with reading modern histories on them. So I'd say start from them, and then you'll understand how you'll understand why the scholars are interpreting it the way they do.
Very well, Krishnan. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Paige, did I see you trying to get in on this?
Yes. Good morning, everybody. I have not read this work, and I'm, putting one toe in, even to mention it and talk about it. So you're coming from tabula rasa here, no background. But I was interested when I listened to your recorded remarks. I realized I needed to understand better what you mean by filiality. Is that the right term?
Yes.
And I wanted to pursue that. And then as I was listening to you this morning, or this noon, for some reason, when you talked about the total lack of the concept of freedom, I thought about Kafka, and particularly his so-called Oriental works, by the building of the Great Wall of China and things like that. And that flashed past my brain. And that lack of freedom there probably, or lack of discussion of the word freedom, probably comes from a very different place, but it may account for something that drew him to his Asian themes. I don't know. Anyway, those two issues, filiality and what to do when Paige's brain flashes Kafka.
I'm not sure what to do with the Kafka part, because I'm not sure what to do when Krishnan's brain flashes Kafka, but I'm not sure Kafka knew what to do with it. But the but the filiality, I think that's a very good point, because that is one of the fundamental differences. In what one might say that in the West, the kind of one of the founding archetypes is something like Oedipus, right, where you kill your father, you marry your mother, and you become your own father, right? So this sense of an individual authoring himself is key to Western individualism that starts from these Greek myths. And so it starts from vanquishing the Greek gods that eat their children. right? And so and so in a way that we have a different starting point there, the sense that we can be authors of ourselves. And it, now one of the culminations is someone like Milton Satan, who is enraged that he isn't the author of himself, right? And so the filiality idea in China, it really kind of gets a kickoff with Confucius, who is relatively late in the game in these histories, so that when you read Sima Qian and you read the early the bits before Confucius, you realize that filiality is not a big thing there. You don't, so you get like unfilial children is not even mentioned much. But then with Confucius, what Confucius does is that he elevates filiality into a central virtue or central set of virtues, right? And what filiality is based on is this recognition that we are not our own origins, right? And it's, the Hebrews, I think, had a similar insight. It's a fundamental insight. We're not our own origins. What does that mean? So then the kind of awe and veneration and gratitude that fills you with becomes a kind of dominating presence in your life. And so then for the Confucians, that generates into a certain reverence towards your parents. Yeah, and from the reverence towards your parents also goes towards your ancestors. Everyone who preceded you. One might say that the study of great books or core texts is an exercise in filiality too, right? To see that we came from somewhere and we treat it with great respect. And so with Confucian philosophy, so it starts from this reverence. It's not uncritical reverence, however. The Emperor Shun that Confucius draws on as a kind of the founding example of filiality. He's the third emperor, right? And he had parents who tried to kill him multiple times. He had truly nasty parents, and there were months on end when he was in despair and anguish over his parents' hatred of him. And he became, emperor in spite of all odds. So I think the Chinese were not idealistic about their parents when they asked for reverence. They were pretty clear about the difficulties of parent-child relationships and how how parents and children just know how to push their own buttons and how intense the feelings become between them. So I think it's not kind of uncritical, idealistic, naive reverence of the parents, but this sense that with filiality, on the one hand, you revere where you came from, you revere your origins and the fact that you're not your own origin, but also you also understand that you're born into something that is often very difficult to deal with, right? Very difficult for a human being to handle. I'm thinking one thing that recurs in Confucian philosophy is age. Right, and what happens when your parents are old and that somebody has to look after them, and then filiality means it's going to be you, right? Because they took care of you when you were a baby. You look after them when they're old. So filiality involves like not shunting them to someone else, but filiality also involves being frankly critical of them when you think they're wrong, right? So you disagree with them, you tell them. And Confucius says you tell them 3 times, and if they still don't accept it, then you shut up and then you go with it, right? And unless going with it is kind of unfilial in a deeper way, right? There's the Emperor Shun was forbidden to marry by his parents out of malice, I think, and he then went ahead and married because he decided that it would be unfilial not to marry and not to give them grandchildren. So he just went ahead and did it, right? And so so it's a little bit flexible, but I think part of the challenge of filiality is learning how to love and live with what's given to you, something you can't change, right? Something that might have more power than you for a certain period of time in your life, and so to be able to love what's given, not what you choose, and find a way to live harmoniously with it, for Confucius became the primary prerequisite of political leadership. Because a leader's got to do that with their own people. You have to love what's given. You have to love who they are, and then work with that, right? So in Confucius, political life or political wisdom starts from filiality, right? And it goes with like the daily training in filiality. Say for a child means, for example, being observant of his parents, being observant of their tone of voice, their facial expressions, their intentions, learning to anticipate what they need, paying attention to micro cues, knowing when they'll say no, and figuring out how to get them to say yes. So there's kind of like training in political life of a child to a parent. And one of the beautiful things about this is that everybody has those conditions, so you don't have to go to school to do this. You've got them right there, right? So you can start right now, wherever you are, so with one of the beauties of Confucian ethical thought is that you start with yourself, you start with self-reflection, and they say you start with what's near at hand, and you use what's near at hand to understand what's far away, right? And so it all starts with filiality, and filiality is it's grounding too, because if you're with Asian families a lot, then you realize that filiality comes with a certain kind of feeling, right? There's a real fondness and affection for parents, no matter how difficult they are. And I think it's different here. I often wonder at my Chinese friends how 3 generations can live in a small apartment together fairly harmoniously. And I know that with all my friends here, if anyone tried that, somebody would die within 2 weeks. So there's a kind of like training in harmonious living that I think is valuable in the practice of filiality. Anyway, I'm going on for too long in this answer. Did that help?
It's very helpful. Thank you, Krishna, very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Scott.
Krishna, once again, good to see you. Okay, I'm coming out of, I've read some of the background texts, Confucius Lao Tse. I haven't read Sima Qian. So I'm out of, and unfortunately I didn't see your talk, but I do have one question that's sort of spurred by your references to Herodotus, Thucydides, reference to origins, and I would even throw in here, biblical texts, Hebrew and or Judeo-Christian. I'm interested in genres. So if you were going to say this is a history, now I think Herodotus has a sense of what a history is. I think Thucydides differs from him in this. And if I were to ask students, is there a history in this Bible? Is it the same thing? Is it different? How's it work? How do you know the differences? I'd be exploring how you make a wide genre, but specific differences under it. Mm-hmm. So that's my question to you. Are there characteristics of this sort of history that would be worth thinking about? And allow me 1 second, because I think you brought it up almost at the beginning, which was, well, read this now, and there's an implication that maybe you'll understand what's going on in your own world today. If I read Thucydides and the archaeology, and I watch this, I like to think of it as a horizontal tornado. It just gets bigger and bigger, it keeps recycling, and it doesn't sweep in just the building of ships or armories. It sweeps into it genres of all sorts, and as it were sources, and even the way he's going to write his history. In fact, maybe the most remarkable sentence of the whole book, I think, is the first one, where basically he says something, I paraphrase, I, Thucydides, decided to write this book because I knew a great war was coming. which is to say he's predicting the future.
Mhm.
He thought he had it. Okay, so that's a function of history for him. I'm sort of curious how functionally, what constitutes the genre here, how you would characterize its differences, not only in substance, but in form. And I'd like you to prompt me to read it a bit more.
Yeah, okay. I mean, every time regarding Thucydides, every time I read a modern history of war or of revolution, I always find myself saying about 100 pages in, why am I reading this? This was in Thucydides. I need to go back and read Thucydides. So this is when he's predicting a great war, it sometimes feels as if he's predicting every great war. So this is how they come up. So, but okay, I mentioned in my talk that.
Oh, my apologies for not seeing the talk.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah. I didn't go into the genre. I put it as a question, so I'm glad you picked it up again. That not every culture of books has history. Like the Indian tradition doesn't have history, right? In any sense, So there's no attempt to pin down what happened. So in terms of Sima Qian, I'd say that the one of the most kind of basic, simple-minded understandings of what history is that it's an attempt to pin down what happened, who did what, when, what's the sequence, where, how do you know, right? And so it's the kind of very common sense view we might have if I always like this thought experiment, and one day I think I will do this to my students. I'll ask them just to go and talk to people and try to figure out what happened in the last 100 years, just from talking to people and looking around you, and just pick 10 people and go talk to them, and of course they'll pick the oldest people possible, and then they'll go talk to them, and then if you can kind of visit the sites to verify, and just see what you see what you can find out. Don't listen to anything that you've read, just go and see what you find out, and so to do what Herodotus did, I think would be very instructive. But the Chinese had, and Sima Qian did some of this. He actually wandered off and saw sites, and at least half of what he wrote about involved people that he knew, or he had met, or that his father knew. So there's a lot of firsthand in there. But so the Chinese had, in the very basic sense, the Chinese had history, in that Sima Qian was building on a tradition of chronicles, annals, where you had you had dates, right? They had a calendar. Mm-hmm. They had a rigorous calendar, so you had like dates. So it's in a way a national calendar. So they had dates, there were places, they knew the distances between places, they had a map sense of the country. So the physical reality, the temporal-spatial foundation for history is in the annals, is in the chronicles, and in the histories that preceded Sima Qian. And some of those are more or less fleshed out. I mean, in the Spring and Autumn Annals that he drew from, that done by Confucius 200 years earlier, there are little dialogues and things, but Sima Qian then does what Thucydides and Herodotus do, is that he enters into these details to get an imaginative fleshing out of how, in an attempt to understand how it is that those things happened, right? Why it was that those things happened, why we came to this pass, and in certain cases it's a literal pass, right? So a little physical pass, So then, so to that extent, all three of them are pretty similar. They're doing the same thing as they know how, and it's the attempt, so nailing down like amounts of time, occasions in time, when things happened, what happened before that happened, what was going on at the same time, right? So this is one of the challenges of Sima Qian, because you have parallel lives going on around a single event, sometimes 20 to 30 lives through which the single event is refracted. And so you have to keep track on who was where when. Right? Sometimes the animosity of one person to another person is explained by the fact that they were at this other event together 20 years before, 250 pages ago, that you didn't notice that, so stuff like that. You have to sort of pay attention, so then another similarity with Herodotus and Thucydides is this complexity of causal relationship, so there's interlocking, not only between events and between cause and effect, but also between people, characters who relations, friendships, things that somebody might have said to someone a while back that offended, right? So emotional causes and consequences, and they are, for the most part means 98% of a non-supernatural nature. Right, so naturalistic, kind of based on awareness of human nature. So part of the power of the book, like with Thucydides and Herodotus, is that it's convincingly grounded in your understanding of how people work, and it might even extend your knowledge of how people work. So sometimes you have these strange conversations, and they have. And they stretch you because you're trying to think what are they understanding when they say this? You can't see where, they seem to be getting each other, but what are they understanding? And then you work with it and you realize, okay, yeah, I see where he's going with this. I see where it's coming from, so like that, they're very similar, so if you're reading Herodotus and Thucydides and Plutarch, you might say you might get the same. I think you will get the same satisfaction from reading Sima Qian. It's as a historical narrative, it's satisfying in many of the same ways. On the other hand, you'll also find that it's a lot more complex. There are many more details. There are many more threads that are happening simultaneously that you have to hold together. Right, so it's an awe-inspiring work in that regard. What I held up is about this thick. The whole work is about this thick. And so as a work of intellect, it's unbelievable. Right? It's unbelievable the amount of stuff that he wielded together, and the stories are good, right? And you have a vast range of characters. But
let me ask one follow-up.
Yeah, go ahead,
if I can. At least without question, Thucydides thinks he's writing for the future. I mean, Herodotus, maybe. Plutarch, possibly. But Thucydides is explicit about this. So one of my interests in arts are sort of like how well they look to the future.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if you're telling me that in this complexity of relations and what it is you have to take into account in order to be, as it were, if you wish, hyperfilial. Okay. Mm-hmm. Is that, in a sense, the web of the future for Sima Qian?
I think he knew he was writing to the future. He explicitly said in his letter to Renan that he's writing a work that's going to be read a long time after. Okay. Whether it's a work of a work for the future, as in a work, as in a political lesson, kind of like in a way a distillation of something that is permanent for the future, that is, timeless. I think he assumed that because I don't think I feel that, right? One difference maybe is in a more complex sense of causality, where you can't boil it down to a few principles. But there's this, one of the things that I get from it is not dissimilar to Tolstoy's view of history, even though it's very simple, but this sense of like multiple threads converging on a single moment, and how things that seem to be little can tip the whole in a certain direction. And much of what you get in Chinese thought generally is a concept of matching. You wait until there's a point in which events are ready to tip, and it's very complex. So you don't get the apotheosis of the warrior type hero who forces a breakthrough. There's not that. But you get the most important characters are the ones who have a wisdom in understanding when things are ready to tip, and then when they're ready to tip, you get this tiny shove and then they tip, right? And so you get a bunch of like sage counselors like that who can take in the complexity of a situation and then watch it and then recognize when the moment is ready and then say the right word so that somebody else takes the action, and then it goes. You have like lots of instances like that. So as a work of wisdom, in which case, which it is geared towards the future, it's trying to teach you to be able to recognize and live with a kind of complexity of action, a complexity of causation that you might get a feel for. It's esprit de finesse. It's not esprit de géométrie. It's not where you boil it down to 3 principles and then put in practice. But it's developing a sensibility. So I think that's what he's trying to do. I think that's what he has, and that's what he's trying to pass on in this work.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to insert myself here because I'm really fascinated by the topic of freedom that you brought up, and it not having the same kind of cachet or value or meaning or something in these texts as they have in Western texts. And I think maybe, so I'll ask my question, but I think maybe what you were just saying to Scott might be involved. So, so I won't belabor this, but I've thought about this most recently in the context of Plato, because in the Republic, for example, I ran a conference here at Mercer, had a lot of people come in and we talked about this question, but clearly tyranny is a bad thing. Good government is a good thing, but not because it's liberating per se. In fact, liberty, freedom seems to just be one step away from tyranny, and people who are attached to it tend to be dangerous, whether they go all the way to tyranny or not. And so you don't have that idea of political liberty like you have later on in the West. On the other hand, there's something that I don't have other words for in Plato, and I'm wondering if you're reframing Sima Qian for me will help with this, but the way that, again, in this crowd I can do this, the way that in book 6 of the Republic, you have this boy who is completely at the mercy of the democratic crowd and his family, and everybody wants to exploit him, and everyone's trying to because he's so excellent, they want him to further whatever their agendas are, and he's completely unfree in the sense of, I'm using more contemporary language now, in the sense of being at the mercy of all of these forces that are impinging on him. And so there seems to be something like what I think of as a kind of liberty or freedom that exists in the capacity, and it's not just negative, right? You're not just free from these influences, but you cultivate yourself. There's something positive about the power of having your own mind, being able to shape up your own life the way that you think is right and good. And you talked a little bit about Sima Qian's biography in the talk, and he plowed a tough row, right? I mean, and the reason I think maybe this is related to Scott's question is because this idea of kind of making the most of what's given, and this idea that this also connected to Page's thing, that maybe within that framework, there's an alternative way to think about what I think about as the freedom that an individual has to be, again, using sort of Platonic terms, sort of self-ruled. But what's the alternative in in Sima Qian, this exists, right? This capacity to write this amazing thing after being tortured, after having a death sentence, after being punished for standing up for someone who was honorable, being treated unjustly. There's something going on with just the act of writing. And it sounds to me like in the stories themselves in Sima Qian that I might want to describe in terms of a kind of a robust, positive sense of freedom or liberty or something like that. How do you reframe that? What are the categories, the words, the ideas that are in his work that you would use to describe that power, that capacity not to be simply at the mercy of your circumstances, but in fact, whatever, I'm
Yeah.
out of words now.
Yeah, that's a great question with, yeah, it's a difficult question. I've just started thinking about it really. So political liberty it's not a concept for these people. And in fact, one thing that's striking about what you say, if you go to Western political philosophy or history, from a Chinese point of view, you realize how obsessed we are with regimes. Right? What's the best regime? So there's a sense that there's a freedom to choose which is the best regime. But the Chinese political philosophers are almost entirely uninterested in the question of regimes. And it's partly because they realize that no matter how good a regime is, one jerk can ruin the whole thing. Right, so you realize that with seminars, but we've seen that recently. So the success of a system has got to reckon with jerks more than regimes, right? And so I think that from an early stage they didn't even attempt to wrestle with the idea of which regime is right. They did have a sense of like what's a bad ruler, what's a good ruler, what a bad ruler looks like, and what a good ruler looks like. And there were different kinds of rulers. There were, like in the early Greek states, good tyrants, bad tyrants. There were oligarchies, like that. No democracies, because there was no sense of a publicly articulated polis, right, with a constitution, also. But we say within Sima Qian, you do get, since you don't have any attempt to articulate in public discourse an idea of freedom or what you can do, what you get can sometimes look a little bit like Stoicism, where you get a kind of, you can work in yourself, you have the power to work on what's around you. You don't have as much power as you think to change people, right? And that's something that we take decades to learn, right? But so you have some recognition of that, but within Sima Qian,
Are you sure we can't really?
I try taking what is near at hand. They change themselves, right? But what you do get in Sima Qian is you do get individuals who do change things, right? And those individuals don't have a notion that freedom is something they should have. So there's no sense of a right to be able to change things. They just get up and change things, and they understand. So part of what enables them to change things is a kind of is spirit, oomph, kind of power of spirit, courage. The usual things, but most above all, intelligence, right? So what you see is the ones who change things in the most deep-seated way, and for the longest amount of time. They have smarts. They're savvy about people. They know how to judge the people in front of them, right? So might not be savvy about theories, but they know how to judge what's happening in front of them. And so you see like many instances of a conversation or a situation where you see somebody making a decision and going with it, and Sima Qian knows that partly they're lucky. You need a certain amount of luck. You need to have people with you. You need to have good, smart people with you. So it's not purely on the individual will, but there's a bunch of conditions that you need to have that the freer people, the ones who are freer to do stuff, know how to work with. Right? Sooner or later, consequences catch up with people. Right? Especially in the longer you are in politics, the more enemies you make. That's just a fact. Right? So sooner or later, stuff catches up with you. And so there's a kind of freedom in recognizing that's going to be the case. Right? And recognizing when it happens. You know, every now and then somebody abdicates and gives up the power to people, and then they go off into the wilds, right? But so they don't expect there not to be consequences, and there's a kind of freedom to be able to freedom and dignity to be able to recognize the consequences of your choices, the consequences of the choices that have been made for you, right? And then to swallow it, right? And just go on. So. Yeah, I don't know if that comes within, you know.
Oh yeah, it's a good start. I mean,
Yeah.
we're gonna need a few more years to sort that one out, but it's a it's a good start. We have about, I don't know, a few more minutes. Time for maybe one more question, if one of you guys has one.
I was really really interested in the comparison to Plutarch, and this focus on biography, but also on type, and wondered if you could just expand on that a bit.
You said on type.
Right, you mentioned that in the talk.
Right. Yeah. So in some ways, when I read Plutarch, I see him as giving us a gallery of types in public life, right? You know, so that we can sort people into these types, and so the types behave with recognizable patterns. But also in Plutarch, they're all individuals, right? And they all have, you know, everyone scratches their ear in a different way. And in Sima Qian, you do have types. You have occupational types as well as character types. You know, so the you know, for example, one thing that's striking in Sima Qian is you have the administrative types, the types that make a country run without being in the limelight, the types that take care of infrastructure, right? That never make front page news for us. And so the ones, you know, so you have those types. So you have types of occupations that make up one of the conditions for big events to happen. You have types of intelligence, right? You have different leadership types, and so part of the fascination with Plutarch, you might have, you do have parallel lives with certain events where the event is refracted through different lives. In Sima Qian, let's say you might have 30 to 40 of those parallel lives around a set of events, right? So the complexity increases, and but like with Plutarch, you also have kind of the satisfaction in seeing how these different types interact.
Krishnan, it's Phil here speaking.
Hi, Phil. Nice to talk to you.
Having heard your various comments this morning, I wonder if you would be able to say for yourself personally what you have learned from Sima Qian that you could not have learned from any other author.
I think among the things I have learned, probably the first has to do with, and it's not a proposition. It's more like a changing of my sensibility, a greater sense of complexity with the events around me. I don't know if it's an answer. It's not a proposition, but it's ability to, I think it's ability to step back and to try to see more of the whole than I've been seeing, and to take in more details that I've been taking in. You know, so that in that regard, it's not that different from what a novelist does. But I think with Sima Qian, I've learned to pay more attention to different threads happening at the same time. So more than kind of learning a set of propositions, I think it's changed my sensibility. I know that's not an answer to your question.
No, it is, in fact.
Okay, thank you.
We still have a minute or two left if we have any other questions. Or perhaps that brings us to a natural stopping point. Thank you so much, Krishnan.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Charlie.
Thanks everybody for coming. Go make some room on your shelf for another big book, because Sima Qian needs to be there. All right.
Yes.
And everyone watching this recording, please check out the other core conversations and all the good things that are happening at ACTC these days. We'd love for you all to get involved. So thanks for coming. Take care. Thanks again, Krishnan.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Right.